Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so with our screencast for today, we're going to be focusing on time period 7. So we're starting to move into more of modern America. We're going to look at World War I, the 1920s, the Depression, World War II. So our screencast for today is going to focus on World War I and the 1920s. So one, foreign policy issue, and also kind of going to touch on how World War I kind of affects America domestically, and then really what's going on in the United States domestically in the 1920s. Part one, we're going to focus on, World War I as a major foreign policy issue for the United States. So again, you always want to think about what is staying the same, what are continuities, what are changes during the time period, and kind of think about that domestically and as far as our interactions internationally. So first thing is that America is going to declare its neutrality really at the outbreak of World War I. So this idea of neutrality is not a new issue in the United States. Think back to the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, when George Washington declared neutrality in 1794. Then again, we tried neutrality, during Jefferson's administration and Madison's administration. So this is again kind of America's approach towards European affairs. And we're able to benefit from a geography of the Atlantic Ocean that kind of keeps America separate. So America does not want to get involved. We kind of see it as Europe's conflict. And we're able to successfully stay out of the war for the first three and a half years or so. And then we eventually get kind of dragged into the conflict. So you want to remember this idea of neutrality as kind of a key piece of American foreign policy, and this idea of trying to stay away from European conflicts. Connected back to earlier to Washington's administration, to his farewell address, to the Napoleonic Wars. And you're going to see the same thing happen again in World War II, this desire to stay neutral and out of European conflicts. Now, some of the reasons that we actually kind of get dragged into the war, so we're talking about America's entrance into the war here, really not, the international reasons for why the war started. Our kind of entrance into the war really kind of revolves around German unrestricted submarine warfare. So if you remember, like the sinking of the Lusitania, which is a British ship in 1915, affects America because we have American citizens on board. And so like the Germans are kind of practicing this idea of unrestricted submarine warfare off and on during this time period between 1914 and 1917. And the British are also kind of restricting Americans' freedom of the seas as well. So the British are mining the North Sea, but the American public by and large sees what the Germans are doing as far as going outright and sinking ships, even if they're not American ships, as more aggressive and more potentially harmful to the United States. So eventually that's one of the reasons that America kind of gets dragged into the conflict on the Allied power side. Now, later in 1918, when the Germans are getting a little bit more desperate, they're going to send out a telegram to Mexico called the Zimmerman telegram, which is essentially trying to convince Mexico to join the war on the Central Power side, on Germany's side. And in exchange, they kind of offer to, if they win, to give back all the land that America took from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. So this again kind of outrages Americans. And it doesn't actually push us into the war just yet. It really kind of takes more unrestricted submarine warfare from the Germans, kind of sinking American ships before we actually are kind of dragged into this conflict. So by 1918, the United States is going to declare war and enter into the conflict. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the home front and how World War I affects America at home. Then we will talk about how it affects America, overseas. We're really not in the war for a very long time. We're really only kind of fighting in the war for about 7 months or so. Now, at home, there's two big things that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with kind of dissent at home and populations who America maybe doesn't fully trust. Like we have a very big German population in the United States. And so like America doesn't really know how to kind of deal with some of these potential dual loyalties that citizens might have. So we're dealing with this, with kind of how to deal with potential dissent on the home front. And then we're also kind of dealing with how to mobilize for the war. So we're first going to talk about dissent. So the federal government's going to pass a series of two acts called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And these acts are to try and basically limit spying and limit negative press about the government and about the war during the wartime effort, because they look at these things, potentially spying, as giving away major secrets of the United States. And then also sedition, they kind of look at it as potentially undermining the war effort. Now, you should make the connection again back to like the late 1700s when we were talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams. In a lot of ways, there's parallels between these two sets of acts that are passed. Now, the Espionage and Sedition Acts are challenged by a famous Supreme Court case in 1919 called Schenck versus the United States. And in this case, Charles Schenck, the person who was suing the U.S. government, he was trying to pass out basically these pamphlets trying to convince Americans to burn their draft cards and to not follow the draft. And so he's going to get arrested for this, and essentially he is charged with violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And so he eventually kind of gets his case to the Supreme Court, trying to argue that it's a violation of his 13th Amendment rights, that it's kind of slavery is kind of a form of involuntary servitude, and that it's also a violation of his First Amendment rights, that his freedom of speech rights. Now, the Supreme Court rules against him, and what they say is that a couple of things. First off, they say that in a wartime situation, you don't have the same full rights that you have in a peacetime situation. The second thing that they say is that freedom of speech is not unlimited. And the example that they give is you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater because it would cause chaos and panic. And so they call this the clear and present danger test as far as freedom of speech. And if it violates the clear and present danger test, then your speech can be restricted. And so therefore, they rule against Charles Schenck in the case. Now, like I said, the other thing on the home front is try to mobilize the American citizenry and the American industries towards victory in the war. We talked about in class how they're trying to convince Americans to grow what they call victory gardens, and our future president Herbert Hoover is kind of a major part of this idea of victory gardens. But what they're also doing is they're also partnering with businesses to try and increase production. And so they're looking for government contracts, or companies in the government are signing contracts with each other in order to facilitate production for the war. And the other thing that they're doing is they're also kind of taking over key industries like the railroad industry. The federal government is going to kind of oversee the entirety of the railroad industry in order to maximize troop movements and maximize products being shipped back and forth across the United States. Okay, now once the war is concluded, you're going to have our president, Woodrow Wilson, try to go overseas and implement his vision for peace with the Europeans. So his idea and his vision for peace becomes known as Wilson's 14 points, because he has 14 major points that he's trying to address when he goes to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. His first major idea is this concept known as the League of Nations, which is really this international peacekeeping body where he envisions kind of every nation kind of sending representatives to the League of Nations and to try and prevent another war like World War I from breaking out. His second idea is this idea of self-determination, where he believes that every nation in the world, or every group of people in the world, should be able to determine who will be their government and their independent status within the world. He wants to try and limit militaries all across the world, so kind of like demilitarize the world. And he also wants freedom of the seas as like a major component of economic trading throughout the world. No more trade barriers, no more limitations on who and where you can trade with, limitations of tariffs. So this is kind of Wilson's vision for the peace. Now, it's not necessarily super well received by the Europeans. So some of his points get in there, like the League of Nations, but most of his other points are not fully accepted by the Europeans. And so when they create the peace treaty, which is called the Treaty of Versailles, really, like I said, the major component from Wilson that gets into the Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations. Now, he brings it back to the United States. So in the United States, the Senate must approve any treaty that's created because they are considered to be a better representation of the people, and kind of that power is given to them, by the founders. So essentially, when they do bring this back to the United States, really the sticking point in the Treaty of Versailles for a lot of Americans is exactly what Wilson fought so hard to get into the Treaty of Versailles, which is the League of Nations. So you have groups of Americans back home who are against this idea of the League of Nations. So you have one group called the Irreconcilables, who are so against the idea of the League of Nations and America kind of entering into it that they refuse to even acknowledge trying to sign this document if that's included. Then you have a group of senators called the Reservationists who have a lot of reservations about the League of Nations, but potentially they might be able to be convinced to approve the Treaty of Versailles. So both of these groups are mostly Republicans, and Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. So there's also a political party infighting and partisanship that's kind of involved in the dispute here. Now, what is their major issue with the League of Nations? This is a very important topic. So their main issue with the League of Nations is this idea that it kind of violates America's sovereignty, and it kind of will get us into entangling alliances, permanent alliances. So it goes way back to Washington's, again, farewell address and his vision for the nation and kind of like his vision for our foreign policy. So a lot of them are against this idea because they don't want to get dragged into European conflicts, and they feel like the League of Nations kind of takes away America's autonomy a little bit, some of our sovereignty as a nation, and we're going to kind of get dragged into conflicts that we really don't want to be a part of, like a World War I type of conflict. So a lot of Americans are kind of weary of this, and you're going to see after World War I, there's going to be a big strain of isolationism in America, where Americans want to be isolated politically and diplomatically in certain ways from the rest of the world because of what our experience and the world's experience was during World War I. So the Reservationists and the Irreconcilables kind of win out here, and the League of Nations is created, but the United States never joins it, and we never sign the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, now after World War I comes to a conclusion, America is going to experience our first Red Scare. So this massive kind of panic, fear of communism kind of spreading to the United States. So with the first Red Scare, you want to be able to compare it to the second Red Scare that we talked about post-World War II. But essentially with this first Red Scare, what we're dealing with is during the war, Russia experienced its communist revolution, and so there's kind of this big fear that potentially this ideology or this idea of communism is going to spread, across the world and maybe potentially spread to the United States. So America kind of links these ideologies, this communist ideology and these more extreme anarchist ideologies. We kind of link them with the big immigrant population coming into the United States at the time. And we talked about this group of immigrants who's called the new immigrants. And so a lot of these immigrants are coming from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Poland, from Southern Europe, like Italy. And so essentially, there's kind of a connection made between at least the American government and some of the American people between these more extreme ideologies and the immigrants coming into the nation. So what ensues is kind of a fear that essentially that this ideology is going to spread in America. And what results from this is something called the Palmer Raids, where the United States, using the FBI, is going to deport not a huge number of immigrants, but they're going to deport some immigrants who they believe to be kind of more either kind of influenced by communism or extremists, like anarchists. And so you kind of see this in kind of the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution that breaks out in Russia. And so again, we have a second Red Scare after World War II, and it's very different in certain ways, the second Red Scare, as far as who it's targeting. So remember, you want to associate this one with targeting immigrants and a high degree of xenophobia that's kind of related to this first Red Scare. Okay, so we're going to wrap our first part of our screencast there. So that's kind of like World War I. In our second part of the screencast, we're going to take a look at the 1920s. So that'll be in part 2, video part 2.